Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Goodwin, and I am a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, and the founding director of our Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you, and I am joined by my colleague, Sarah Bronin, who will be introducing herself in just a moment. It's our pleasure to welcome you to a very dynamic day, we expect, symposium, half day, on reckoning and reconciliation, art, architecture, and culture in contested sites. This is a meeting where we hope to engage you and think about law, society, and culture, race, and art through a really dynamic lens. And as such, we start from the premise that art, architecture, and culture are fluid and embodied not only on surfaces or in spaces, but also deeply imprinted on the human body. And as such, appropriation, exploitation, and even theft are not static concepts nor limited to land. And certainly during Black History Month, as we think about this, this has been part of race and legacy in the United States. From the very beginning of colonialism here and what happened to indigenous people being pushed off their lands and into reservations, to the kidnap and exploitation of Black peoples taken from Africa and brought to these United States. Today, we have a dynamic conversation that will take place that will engage art, culture, and architecture as we talk through myriad of these issues from a very unique space. So I want to turn this over now to my colleague, Sarah Bronin, who's at the University of Connecticut, as she can tell you about today's agenda, and then we're going to dive right on in with our first panel, Thinking About Culture.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and welcome to everybody. I am beaming into you from Hartford, Connecticut, where I serve as a chair in real property law and also help to run our Center for Energy and Environmental Law. Our panels today we start with a culture panel, again, as Michelle said, a very dynamic group of speakers. We move next into architecture, and then finally we'll be turning to art. We started talking about this conference just a few months ago, and when Michelle gave an excellent faculty workshop talk at the law school, and we realized that this area of focus of the conference today really overlaps both property law, which I work in, health law, which she works in addition to many other areas. But there's so much overlap in the question we're considering today. And just on a personal note, I've been interested in this topic, perhaps for my whole life, given a story from my family, which I'll share just briefly. 8 generations ago, my ancestors were evicted from their land after eminent domain, a property law concept that was exercised by then General Zachary Taylor. It was land in the southernmost portion of the United States in Brownsville, Texas. That land became the perch from which the US government took over Mexico. Looking at that and thinking about that in my own family's history, it really raises a lot of the questions that we'll be considering today. So what is the connection between people and their places, between memory and interpretation? That particular site that I've been talking about stands as a National Historic Site, and public interpretations about that site, what was my family's homeland, are about white conquest, not about what we lost or about what the land represents. So in thinking about the questions today, thinking about reckoning and reconciliation, how do we turn a site like that, a place, into something that becomes a healing place? How do we think about loss in not just embodied places or not just in rather architecture or art, but also in our bodies? So I look forward to the conversation that we have today. And I'm really thrilled that Michelle is leading the conversation, and I'll turn it right over to her for the first panel.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, let's get started. So we're joined on this first panel by Deborah Zoe Laufer, Priscilla Ocen, and Jennifer Terry. You've been able to see on the slides their backgrounds, and really, because we want to make sure that we dive in and we get as much rich content here, let me just say really briefly, with Deborah Zoe Laufer, my first opportunity to really engage with her work was when she came to UCI to do so that we could do a presentation of her play, Informed Consent, which engages exactly what you just heard in many ways about what Sarah and her family experienced. And it was to unpack and think about Native Americans and informed consent with regard to medical experimentation and DNA, the taking of DNA and the use of that DNA for means beyond what the people in that community would have wanted it for. I've known Priscilla Ocen for a very long time, and she's a professor of law at Loyola Law School and has written brilliantly about state attacks on pregnant women, including the shackling and the humiliating treatment of incarcerated pregnant women. And then Jennifer Terry, such a wonderful colleague at UCI and the former chair of gender and sexuality studies here, but whose work has been at the intersections of sexuality, modernity, state-sponsored violence, and biomedicine, and so much more. All right, so I've got you all together, and I want to start off with the following question. And that is, how should we think about a healing space? Because we think about reckoning and reconciliation, and your work has taken you to many different spaces across the country, both physically and then also in thinking about what this means in terms of the body itself. So I want us to think about what makes a healing place. And I'll turn it over to any one of you who wants to jump in. What's a healing space? So maybe what I'll do is start with you, Priscilla. What makes a healing space given the work that you have done exposing the traumas that have been experienced by women of color?
Yeah, I think about this a lot in my work in terms of how the state has so viciously assaulted the reproductive and sexual capacities of Black women, both historically and contemporarily in the United States. So when I think about what is a healing space, I think about the struggles of Black women, girls, and femmes in the United States to essentially reclaim their bodies, to reclaim autonomy and control over their physicality, to assert agency over what happens with their bodies, what they do with their bodies, how they exist in their bodies. And so for me, when I think about the healing space and frameworks like intersectionality, reproductive justice, which Michelle, I know you are so well versed in and well grounded in and have helped shape us think about, you know, one of the sort of core principles of reproductive justice is that we as people who identify as women, whether that's cis or trans or non-binary, that we ought to be able to make choices with our bodies, to exercise those choices in safety and dignity, to be able to raise our families or not to have families with adequate support, and to have a basic forms of dignity that undergird us as we move through the world. And as I think about my ancestors, particularly I'm learning about it's interesting we're talking about DNA. I'm thinking about my ancestors, who I'm now learning about. My ancestor, Annie Richardson, who was a sharecropper in Edgeville, South Carolina, who had very little choice about what she could do with her body and when, the kind of laboring that she did, the way it was recognized or denigrated or invisibilized in society. And I think about the kind of healing place that would center and ground her. And I think it's a place where she has the dignity of work, where she has the dignity of wage, where she can have safety for her children, where she doesn't have to fear that they will be subject to extrajudicial violence and killing, where we won't be subject to deadly viruses at disproportionate rates, right? So I think a healing place is a safe place. A healing place is a place with agency, control, and where we are exerting control of our own bodies. And I think that's really the legacy and the work of Black feminist theorists, reproductive justice, And I think it's the legacy of the work of women like my great grandmother, Annie Richardson. And so that's the kind of healing place that I try to imagine and envision in my work, so that imagining can lead us down a path to a reality of a healing place. So thank you for the question, and thank you for starting us there.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to build off of that, in fact, and turn to you, Jennifer, and then to you, Deborah, which is then to think about sites, I mean, places, and the contestation of sites. Can you tell us about how sites relate to your work? And then how that work has clearly been driven by thinking about harm and healing.
Sure, thank you so much. I mean, it's just such an honor to be in the part of this conversation. So much can be said about this question. When I read it first, when Michelle made the invitation, I thought, what makes a healing place? I immediately thought anything but a hospital, or anything but a clinic, or anything but an ICU, because I've been working with a group of people that are thinking about design, and I'm so eager to hear about the architecture panel that's coming up. But rather than just dwell on that, because so much of my work has really looked at trauma medicine and how that has emerged out of deliberate acts of wounding, i.e. war and empire, and the ways in which healing has been defined in many respects through biomedicine as that which repairs the harm done in war or in sites of trauma. So police violence and military violence is part of the knowledge production of how to deal with bodies that are wounded. So it's this weird paradox of like deliberate wounding is tied to an industry of deliberate healing. And so I was, spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on with that strange paradox and how is it in some respects uniquely American.
Can I just stop you there for just one moment? Because you've dropped so many microphones in that space, right? I mean, that's pretty powerful just where you started in terms of thinking about the healing place is not the hospital. It's not the clinic. And this makes me think about the histories of people of color, especially African Americans in this country, being denied medical care. Being actually, I mean, even recently, I mean, we know that these things happened in Jim Crow, where there are Black people who literally died on the front steps of hospitals. And many people would be surprised to know that these things strangely continue to happen. So I needed to just make that one intervention because it's stunning what you're sharing. So I'm sorry, Jennifer, please go on.
Well, no, I mean, I think there's, and this is the best way to have a conversation like this is that, I've struck, Michelle, when I was thinking about this too, about the labor that happens within clinics and the invisible labor, the labor that happens at night, the cleanup, the sanitation. And so if we're thinking about people of color being, especially Black people in the United States, being kept from clinical care or in those sites of clinical care, literally violated, then we also think about labor and laboring conditions. A healing place would be a place where labor is not exploited the way it is currently in most, inner city hospitals and inner city clinics. So just to pull that thread into this too. So I just want to echo some of the things that Priscilla was saying. I think I would add to what she said, in addition to dignity, safety, the qualities of nutrition and clean air and clean water, I would add too truth, because I think we're in the assault on truth in our current political environment is so profound, and science can't be the only thing that counters that assault on truth. There has to be other ways of knowing that are not so specifically scientific that are about healing. I'm thinking about body work, therapeutic practices, the arts that involve that. So just to drop that into the conversation.
So given that, Priscilla, Jennifer, amazing. I just spent time around that all. All right, so Deborah, your work lifting up origins, and of course your work is more expansive than the play on informed consent, but that's pretty powerful. And it was before even the sort of recent sense of the kind of urgent, let's find your DNA, let's see where you're connected to, because you wrote this play a while ago, and you wrote it thinking about and lifting up various narratives of exploitation. So I want to turn to you about this question then about healing place and sites, how you located your work and what you got out of that work in terms of going to the very spaces in which people had been exploited.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of this conversation. What I'm going to tell you is probably not what you are expecting about my story of this play. I did start writing it about 10 years ago. It took me 3 years to write. And since then, I've learned a tremendous amount. And I would say the theater is is a healing place, because the theater has taken, the theater community has really grown in our understanding about whose story is being told by whom. And 3 years ago, I decided to stop licensing this play, so it will never be seen on an American stage again, or really any stage in the world. And it's, I started writing the play thinking that it's a very important story to tell, that it featured both religion and science, which is a place that I'm really excited about. And it was, I felt like a people who really needed their story to be told. But I've come to realize, until American stages are filled with the stories of underrepresented people being told by them, it should not be told by anyone else. And because of that, I feel like, well, I don't feel like, there's been a real revolution in theater. And I think in the next few years, we're going to see really a renaissance of new stories being told by people who haven't had their own voice to tell those stories. So my journey of learning with this play has been very painful. And
Could you
also,
tell the audience perhaps a little bit about the play for those who aren't
Yeah.
familiar?
The play is about a tribe who lives in the Grand Canyon, and they had the third highest rate of diabetes in the world, and there were only around 600 members. It was a very, very isolated and vulnerable tribe. The government had taken away all their resources, that they had no ability. In the small amount of land they were given, they had no ability to farm, they had no ability to hunt, their clean water was cut off. And so they were eating what was flown in, which was essentially our crap. They were eating Velveeta cheese, and that's really what could be gotten. And you know, sometimes when I went there, it was 117 degrees. So and so the diabetes, I think, was very much related to the situation that our government put them in. And a scientist from Arizona State University saw a wonderful opportunity to take their blood, research it, and see, because when you have an isolated group like that, what you can learn from their DNA is enormous. And she took their blood, even though their religion really doesn't allow them to give blood for any reason, but their situation was so dire and they were in so much need that they allowed it. And then she used that research for all kinds of other purposes that they had not understood would be happening. And the reason it's a really significant court case is because for the first time, it was understood that informed consent had to be given not only for medical reasons, but also for emotional reasons, that people needed to be protected on more fronts than just what was going to do bodily harm.
So with that, then I'd love to open it up to a conversation where any of you can jump in, because I'm curious about how power and hierarchy relates to then your work. What do you see in terms of power and hierarchy with regard to race, sex, LGBTQ status, colonialism, you know, that informs your work, that's driven you to do the work that you write about? Each of you are writers, in addition to being, you know, the other part of what, you know, of expression. You each write. So what is it about power or hierarchy? Do you see power played out in the spaces that you write about and occupy? Maybe I'll start with you, Jennifer. And why don't
Thank
we all
you.
go like off mute, just to have a conversation, like if we were having some wine around the dinner table.
Sounds very good.
Yeah, I was gonna say I went first last time. I will definitely be happy for Jennifer to start us off.
Well, this question about authority, and I mean, I just made that link between power and authority. Perhaps that's too automatic, but anyway, I think, when we're thinking about what occurs to me in my own writing and thinking in this conversation is the degree to which medical authority, for example, is a contested site, right? And what kinds of interventions we can make in the medical profession and medical training and, medical practice. That's one place where the authority can be argued over. And the history is not great on this because women and Black people and people of color in general have been so kept from those positions of authority deliberately. So making up for that is not some quick and easy thing that happens. It really is about reckoning. But I was also thinking, very often when I'm teaching, I talk to my students about greed as a motivation and how much that, the relationship between greed and power, because for me, the political economy of all of this matters very much. These are not just attitudes, they're supported by material conditions. So when I'm thinking about, medicine and the military, I think about these kinds of, opportunities for profit, and they often seem to be much more important than the healing practice itself. So I toss those ideas in. And just one other thing, to make a point clear to my students, often I talk about the monopoly that the police and the military have on legitimate violence, quote unquote, legitimate violence. And because there are lawyers in this conversation, I'm always very interested in talking with you about how you negotiate the law as a platform of contested authority, right? So those are things that your question prompts, Michelle. And one more thing, and that is the soft power, as it's called, that operates within the scenarios that I'm looking at, where care is mobilized as a trope for doing all kinds of different power moves. I'm thinking about how soft power is a form of cultural arrogance that as much as I'm super happy that the Biden-Harris administration is in now, I think we're going to see more of that soft power come back in through these acts of empire that mobilize care in a way that we need to really be careful about, I guess.
Tie in on that.
I'll jump in. Yeah. So I'll jump in there on sort of the mobilization of care. I think, so my work studies the race, class, gender dimensions of the carceral state. And the way that the carceral state is used as a mechanism to mark and reinforce difference and normative identities, right? And a critical part of the way in which carcerality marks difference is through the deployment of language, right? In the ways I think that, Jennifer, you're talking about. It's sort of this very sort of post-structuralist way of, understanding that the truth of something, right? This idea of truth is inextricably bound up, folks say it's bound up in the ways in which it's described, right? The language that it's used to describe something. So we can use abstractions in law, for example, like criminal, like inmate, like the unhoused or the homeless, right? To marginalize and subjugate and authorize the use of violence, of state violence in a myriad of forms and across a range of institutions. So that's the relationship I'm really interested in, the way that law, language, carcerality, and difference are inextricably linked as a mechanism to subordinate and control populations, and populations that are then targeted through the use of language by markers like deviance, which authorizes violence like sterilizations, shackling, denial of support and services, undeservingness, and so forth. So I think when we talk about law, the language and the abstractions that we use are critically important to how violence and authority are deployed in very harmful and destructive ways in the lives, particularly of Black women and femmes.
That's so true, right? I mean, it's the normalization. That's also fascinating too, right? So the expectations that there are certain people to be treated in particular ways such that we shouldn't be surprised when they're treated in that way, right? The very idea the police punishment in a particular way. I mean, and that too was fascinating, and maybe we should go there, right? It seems to me that and Deborah, please jump in at any time, right? It seems to me that until Michael Brown's death, right, Black people had been saying for a very long time, here are the things that happen to Black people in police stops. Been saying there are people who die in police stops who are unarmed. Had been saying that children get brutalized, all of that. And then Michael Brown dies. And in the wake of his death, as Black people are outraged, there's some white folks who are outraged, but others that are saying, well, he must have done something to be shot that many times. They said, well, because otherwise this doesn't happen. And that came from allies, right? Like, clearly a police officer doesn't do that. And now if you're Black, you're thinking the police officer, security of this kid that was jaywalking, what, leaves an officer, he's so in fear of a kid walking in the middle of the street that kid's body ends up being riddled with bullets, right? And there was like this disconnect. And so then after that, people turned to their Samsungs and iPhones and all of that. And what we've seen now is just a litany over and over again, caught on camera, of Black death. How much of that is just normalized that we are a country that has been used to that kind of pornography of pain when it comes to certain communities? Is that just simply normalized? And let's face it, we've got this today, but we have in the past the postcards of lynchings. So I want to put that on the dinner table as we sip our virtual wine.
Yeah, I mean, well, I just spoke, so let me pass it on. Let me invite Deborah. No. I'll wait. Let me pass it on to Deborah.
Hey, Deborah, okay, with your glass of wine, right?
I have nothing that wise to say except that I'm always thinking, oh, things are changing. It's changing, and then I get very excited and I think, well, look at that. We're making progress. And my son, who is obviously getting news in a different way than I'm getting news, will send me something every day about another kid of color who's been killed. I mean, I don't feel that I get that information in the same way, or that it's not distributed in the same way. And I think that's part of it. I keep thinking, oh, things are changing, and then and that's out of an ignorance. I don't understand how they're not.
Is that also, do you think, out of a sense of hope and desperation? Because otherwise we've had to sort of confront a very difficult truth about our country, right? I mean, because you'd say that, like, objectively what we know, I think in some ways, perhaps we've been kept from the things that we objectively know, right? Like if we sort of like think about it objectively, what have been the norms that are really hard to reconcile, and I have relatives from the South. My maternal grandparents were from Mississippi. And at a certain point within the last few years, it's really dawned on me the importance of, when I'm asked to give talks and whatnot, and depending upon the talk, to center the following. And that is that, I wonder about what it takes in a nation, right, to authorize, support, allow to happen more than just an hour, children being bid upon, right? So if you imagined, right, what was slavery, right? I mean, it was a fundamental part of it was the auction block, right? It's an architecture, it's a culture, it's an art in a way, and people standing around and people bidding. Now, if we heard about this taking place 100 miles from where we live, or if we were in a movie theater and the director had 15 minutes of kids being bid upon, right, and the very grotesque ways in which it happened, some people might say, well, that's extreme. Oh my gosh, that's gratuitous. We had to sit through 15 minutes of watching a kid and perhaps the kid's mother being auctioned off. And they say that's too much, but we're not a country that said too much after 15 minutes, or even an hour, or even a day, or even a month, or even a year. We kept doing this over and over and over again for a space of centuries. Now, if one were to say you start with that foundation and you wonder, what stories do people tell themselves that say that this is normal and natural and this is a good thing, right? When you have to convince yourself that that child is no different than a pig or a goat or a sheep or a horse off in the fields, right? Because that's the justification. So I wonder, given that that is our history, right? That is what we know. How can we be surprised today?
I think the answer is, sorry. Okay, so I think the answer is that we can't be surprised. You know, as you said, this country was formed in through the crucible of violence, through enslavement, through settler colonialism, that necessitated the creation of ideologies and constructs that fundamentally dehumanized people, that produce what Orlando Patterson calls natal alienation, right? Which is, right, we have a fundamental human need to be connected to our generations. And what enslavement did was to separate us from our lineage, from our generations, in other words, to dehumanize us. And what's interesting, I think, about the power and the violence and the authority of the carceral state is that is in some ways how Black people were recognized as human. So what I mean by that is a case, what I mean by that, I'll talk about a bit through the case of an enslaved woman named Amy. So Amy was charged with theft of mail in the 1850s. Her case was litigated up to a circuit court just after Dred Scott was decided, where the Supreme Court, in an opinion authored by Justice Taney, said, you know, Black people are not persons. They don't have standing as citizens, and they don't have any rights which any white person is bound to respect, right? So Black people are not persons. They're not constitutional persons. They're not juridical persons, and they have no standing. And this is because they are enslavable, right? So we have that. And just a year later, Amy comes before Justice Taney, who's riding circuit, meaning that he's taken on an assignment for a lower court. And she argues, I can't be punished for a federal offense. And she is the first Black person to be prosecuted for a federal offense of theft of mail. She says, I can't be prosecuted because I am not a person. Because the statute says any person who steals the mail, so on and so forth. She says, I can't be prosecuted because I'm not a person, right? And Justice Taney says, no. People of African descent are persons for some purposes and property for others. And so for the purposes of punishment, for the purposes of social control and regulation, Amy was recognized as a person. For one of the first times in US history where Black people were given that designation, an enslaved person was recognized not just as a person, not just as property, but as a person for purposes of punishment, to make her available for state violence and state control. And so that is the history of Black people in this country, that we are simultaneously non-juridical persons for the purposes of the assertion of our rights, but we are also persons for purposes of punishment, for purposes of subjugation to the state. And so this history is very real, very much alive and living, right, and ongoing. And this is what, you know, Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. We're living in it. It's not past, it's present.
Jennifer, you were going to jump in there. And of course, that also makes me think about Margaret Garner, which most people know her story through Toni Morrison's Beloved. But again, that contestation, right, of the Black woman who, you know, it takes something to literally walk across a frozen river without the benefit of parkas and all the rest of that, because you were so desperately trying to leave a system of enslavement and bondage, and so trying to leave it that you would attempt to kill your children and yourself. And the question in that case ends up being exactly that, you know, person or chattel, because depending upon which way the law sees her will end up being how she is punished. Jennifer, you were going to offer.
Well, this is in light of what Priscilla just said. I'm not sure if this exactly fits, but let me try something that was prompted by your question, Michelle, a minute ago, which is and I'm coming back to the reckoning. You mentioned, you know, the kind of ubiquity of visual data or information that we're bombarded with in terms of Black death and the kind of pain porn that you were pointing out, and that this has a much longer history. And I wonder if there's a way we can think about that in relation to what Priscilla just laid out about culpability, punishability as a condition for personhood, but the rest of the time, mere property, or for the consumption of media consumers, mere visual spectacular data to be stimulated by. So the question always is, when Emmett Till's mom decided to put that photograph, get that photograph into circulation of his body in the open casket at his funeral, there was a turning point. Many people remarked that people now could see the destructive capacities of white mobs. And that was to me, that's always been so interesting, because like, who hasn't seen it up till that point? Who hasn't seen this scene up to that point? And granted, it was kind of important for, to change the visual vocabulary within certain polite society that didn't want to look at that stuff, didn't want to see Black death. But I'm wondering now about how, the spectacle of Black suffering is, part of what is a contested site, I guess is what I would say. And I think for a lot of activists, the question of the circulation of images on Twitter or anywhere else, Instagram, without captioning, without any kind of like deeper understanding of what these bodies, what history they belong in, seems to be like right alongside the efforts of certain school districts to keep Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project out of the curriculum, so it's about visibility, right? It's about conditions of visibility, how things will be taught, and images don't speak for themselves.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. The notion that images, right, it makes me think about, Foucault as well, as we have this conversation, the kind of need of a kind of parading of horrors. And it's interesting to think about who needs that, because you can think about it in terms of that itself exerting power. When I think about images of lynching and the picnics that would take place, where whole families would gather, where white mobs would bring their children in their Sunday best of clothing and have picnics and things like that, and then would write about to their relatives how they, if they were lucky or fortunate, sometimes took pieces of the flesh of the person who had been hung and then perhaps inflamed, put on fire, torched, and would keep these kind of mementos of that. And so I'm wondering what the sort of power is behind this kind of pornography of pain, if you will, because I also think that in the effort to actually find healing, that sometimes even allies want aspects of this kind of show me your pain.
Yeah.
And it's not until you show me your pain that then I can feel better about perhaps coming to aid. And so I want to tease that out. It's an imperfect question. And I want to turn it over to you, Deborah, because you've had to struggle with this notion with your own play, right? A play is powerful, impactful, but to say, well, no, I won't be a part of that. Was this any part of your imaginings when you decided that this won't be licensed anymore? I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to participate in that. Or was it something else?
No, that is a big part of it. And yeah, it should not come from me, for one thing. And I do think a lot of good came from the play, just to say that, but it doesn't weigh evenly. I have just one other, this is a very divergent topic, but I do want to say that it's very hard to build trust after the wrongs that have happened. I mean, I know with the tribe, after their blood was misused, they refused medical treatment. And these were people who were desperately in need of medical treatment. And they had prior to that had treatment, and it was helping them. And when they learned what had happened to their blood, they no longer trusted the medical community. And I think about how, again, left-leaning, we're like, people of color should get the COVID shot first. And I think, why would they trust this shot, especially when they're being told they should have it first? And there's an enormous problem that people will refuse that. And why wouldn't they, when they've been used for medical testing for, you know, for a century? So it's a long running, like the memory you were, I just was thinking that because part of what you were talking about is the memory of it. We don't, it's like the wrongs that are done don't just go away.
You know, I'd like to turn to that then as we turn to the last quarter of this panel, which has been so incredibly rich, is to think about these questions of trust. So how do we, in spaces of culture and art and architecture and thinking about power and hierarchy, how does one forge trust given this backdrop? Is that the language that we should be leaning into? How do we move forward? Deborah, you shake your head, right? And is that because it's something that you've thought about and that there's a real struggle behind this question of what does trust look like given the backdrop of our histories?
Yeah, it's very hard. I personally believe story is the way that we find empathy or understand what other people have gone through. I think story is really the key to change. And, you know, I work in the theater, and the theater is a very elitist entity, really. I mean, who gets to see theater? So, yeah, but telling the stories is where I find hope.
Mm-hmm. And what about platforms? So I want to open this up to everybody again. So what about platforms to be able to tell the stories as well? Because you know, who listens, right? So you hope to be able to have the kind of platform first where the work that you are producing actually, you know, is realized to be seen by other people. And I think that there are questions around that. So let me just, another imperfect commentary or question. How do we build trust and how do we get this kind of platforms in order to be able to tell the stories? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I'll start. So, you know, one of the things that I do in addition to my writing and academic work is I serve as a commissioner for the Civilian Oversight Commission of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which is one of the largest jailers in the world, one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world, one of the most violent, one of the most deadly in the world. And one of the things that we're charged with is promoting trust and transparency. But one of the problems I have with that framing is that you can't have trust without accountability. You can't have trust without justice. So trust is not a precursor to accountability, it's a consequence of it. You can't have unity, right? We're now in this time where after the Capitol insurrection and all of these lies about the election, you know, the targeting of people for assassination, nooses outside of the Capitol, the Confederate flag, you know, being brought into what's, you know, the citadel of American democracy. You know, we have these calls for unity. And I think it's the same with trust, right? We can't have unity without accountability and consequence, right? We have to have that first. And I think part of that is tied to your question about, you know, interpretation and memory, right? So we have to have a corrective of how we understand our collective history. And I think about one of my favorite poems by Lucille Clifton, and the poem's titled, and I'm going to read it. It's called "Why They Be Mad at Me Sometimes." And she says, "They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine." Mm-hmm. So I see memory as a mode of resistance, memory as a mechanism of accountability, and memory as a mechanism for a corrective of the interpretations of American history that's grounded in innocence, goodness, Christianity, ableism, and whiteness, and masculinity, right? So we have to use that memory, that radical memory that I think Clifton here is talking about, as a corrective to the stories that we tell ourselves in this country about who we are and what we do, and what these labels like criminal mean, like these labels like deviant mean, like these labels like disability mean, that are used to absolve us of culpability and to resist truth, accountability, and to undermine or make impossible any concept of trust.
You know, it's interesting that you should say that too, because that makes me think about pathways to freedom, and especially in law. So the pathway to freedom in law was not the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a wartime effort, a wartime proclamation. It was temporal. It did not end slavery, as many people grow up thinking. What Lincoln said is that you join the Union, you keep your slaves. You don't join the Union, I'm going to free them as of X date. But it was really the 13th Amendment that does that work, right? It's the creation of an amendment to the Constitution that abolishes slavery. But just as you were speaking that, Priscilla, what comes to mind is the punishment clause of the 13th Amendment, right? Like the first part of it is like, let there be no slavery. But right after that is the punishment clause, which is except if convicted of a crime. And this history, for the most part, I mean, for over 150 years, most law schools have not concentrated on that second part of the clause. And on that second part of the clause is what has led to misdemeanor laws. And right after slavery led to the re-enslavement of so many Black people, because all that had to happen in the South, and they did it, was to make all sorts of things a crime if you were Black, such as if you sell rice if you are Black. That's a punishable crime that comes with a fine. If you sell wheat and you are Black, it's a punishable crime, right? And so many of these kinds of things, thinking about trust, thinking about freedom, it's bound in this, but look over your shoulder because there's something else happening. I'm wondering if anybody has any response to that. Jennifer, Deborah, Priscilla.
Yeah, I want to, I was thinking back about, when trust is framed in terms of something you gain, like it's a metric, there's a transactional logic in that, and it presumes level playing fields and all this other nonsense. And what Priscilla said about, accountability is the precondition necessary for even imagining whether there can be trust, because how that accountability is registered and, in what form it takes. I'm thinking, as we're talking about this, the aspirations and failures of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where, part of the problem, critics say, is that the accountability question will be framed as immunity. And that, then the storytelling ran amok with all kinds of, the pain porn. And those speaking that language were not being accountable. They were not even being confessional. They were almost reveling in the fact that they got away with this stuff because they were not going to be punished for it. The South African police force and so I'm thinking about, in what context, even within the law or extra legally, could one imagine a kind of articulation of the truth, accountability, and change within the structures that would be really meaningful, so that a sheriff's department can't keep behaving with such intense violence as the LA County Sheriff's Department does. I mean, these are the predicaments, like how do we actually, work within the structures that exist, or do those need to be fundamentally changed for accountability to really register as something other than we now can move past that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Deborah.
I just want to add that it's both accountability and also there's tremendous profit to be made. There's tremendous profit to be made by incarcerating people, and that's a system that has to change. I mean, people are very reluctant to change when it affects them economically, as ending slavery. You can make excuses as long as it's going to be profitable for you.
Well, this also brings to mind, and I should remind our viewing and listening audiences that there is the opportunity to ask questions, and you can put those in the Q&A, and we will lift them up throughout our meeting today. But this reminds me also of perhaps another slice before I let you all go. And you're just so wonderful. I'm so pleased and honored to be with you. This is amazing. This panel, everybody needs to see this over and over again. So you've led me to this question about the mind, right? So we could talk about the physical space someplace, it was Arizona, where there's Africa, which is the ports in North Carolina, South Carolina, where Black bodies are brought. Jennifer, your work in war zones, all of that. But it seems to me also there's something about what's captured in the mind. And when I hear you talk about LA County jails, that also happens to be the largest mental health facility in the country and maybe in the world, right? So how do we come to a space of understanding the cruelties on the mind in terms of, this question of reckoning and reconciliation? What happens to people emotionally, psychologically?
Yeah, I think part of what you're describing is, what sometimes I think about as a jurisprudence of gaslighting, right? Where we're told what we see is not what we see. What we experience is not what we experience, right? We could think about the civil rights cases, speaking of the 13th and 14th Amendment, where the Supreme Court, just 10 years after slavery, in the midst of racist violence, systematic, right? The ascension of the Klan, the collapse of Reconstruction, the widespread lynching and racial terror, Michelle, that you mentioned, the Supreme Court had the audacity to say, Black people, when are you going to stop being the special favorites of the law?
You can't make that up. I was just quoting that recently. You can't make that up.
They can't. You can't. And they said you are running the slavery argument into the ground after 400 years of enslavement and 10 years of quasi-freedom. Less than 10 years, you are running the slavery argument into the ground. Fast forward 100 years, Shelby versus Holder. The Supreme Court tells us that we don't know what we know and we don't experience what we experience when they strike down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And they say that we don't have widespread voter suppression and discrimination in this country. You are running the slavery argument into the ground. You are running the Jim Crow argument into the ground less than 30 years of a multiracial democracy that is consistently contested. So that to me is the key piece about memory and our cognitive processes, is that the power of the law is to declare the realities that we experience and to tell us what we experience isn't what we experience, to systematically gaslight us into submission and our own subordination. So that to me is why memory is resistant in the way that Lucille Clifton talked about.
I wonder if that's going to be the title of a future article or essay of yours, because I love that kind of gaslighting our collective memory.
Yeah.
But that is it, right? I mean, it is exactly that, right? And you see that also along traditional kind of lines that affect women too, right? That whole notion of being hysterical and hysteria. You don't know what you were talking about, even though everything around suggests I can't vote, restricting where I can work. You're telling me that I can't be educated at these places, but then now you're telling me that it's all in my mind.
Mm-hmm. You give me, I'm writing it down right now. Let me go ahead and write this abstract.
Yeah, it's a rich one. It's great. All right. So as we move towards the final aspects of this, and someone's saying, preach. I love that. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great conversation. So, all right. So as we come towards the end of this panel, which I just wish we could go on and on, really, what's the silver lining? Is there a silver lining that we could see coming? I don't want to be Pollyannish, but right. But what is it about the work that you do that keeps you going? Let's say, right? Because there's a reason why you do what you do, and behind it must be to be transformative. That's how I see each of you. So in our last couple of minutes, what's the silver lining? I'll start with you, Deborah.
I see new work being done and new people being on stage, and that is very exciting. Sometimes it's time to listen. I feel like I learned so much from this panel today. I want to thank you all. I think it's time for me to listen for a while. Thank you.
All right, Jen.
I would just say, I think perhaps it's just, I am absolutely inspired, and I mean deeply so, by my undergraduate students, many of whom are undocumented students. They're first generation students. There's something that's really worth fighting for about keeping these universities going. And I know that's a tip of the iceberg for who's allowed to attend them and who's in the position But I think, you know, I feel so profoundly sure that learning is a site of really important organizing right now, both formally and informally. And the kind of scholarship that Priscilla's generating, and that we're able to, the theater, it may be transforming, but I think there's also, as a consequence of a lot of hard work and tenacity, there are more voices in the world of critical theory than there have been respected before. So I'm grateful for the scholarship that's being generated. I'm grateful for the receptivity of young people to hear about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, I went to Uganda for the first time a few years ago to meet my family. My dad's from Uganda, I'd never met them. And when we were welcomed into my dad's village, the women started to sing, and they went around in a circle and they were singing in their language. And my uncle translated a bit of it because he was laughing. I was like, what's funny? And one of the lines was from these women was, and it was our clan song. We organized like that, the clan song, and they're singing it. And one of the lines was, "We don't fear the white people." And apparently that line was introduced into our clan song in the early 1900s, early 20th century, you know, as the British were sort of establishing themselves in Uganda. And there was resistance coming from the Acholi people of northern Uganda. And I tell that story to answer your question, which is I'm optimistic because of the power that's behind us. The work of our ancestors, the labor that they've done to help us to retain our memory, the inspiration that they've given us with their language, with their activism, with their radical conceptions of humanity. And I'm also optimistic because of the work that I see, like Jennifer said, our students doing and young people doing in terms of their radical imaginations and their imaginaries about what the world could look like. They're pushing us to move in a direction that we hadn't even conceived of in terms of, you know, trenchant critiques of capitalism and heteropatriarchy, and really pushing us to think about new modes of existence. And I think that is so exciting. And, you know, we're in this moment of crisis, but they're helping us to think about how we can turn this into opportunities, because we see that the way that we are doing things is a death machine. Mm-hmm. And if we want to live, we got to change. And that makes me feel so optimistic because of those memories and because of the possibilities.
Well, I want to thank you for that. I want to thank each of our panelists as well as our interpreters, Kaylin and Arthur. Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Deborah. And we do have some questions that lifted up, but I want to give room for our next panel. But I'm hoping that we can carry on this conversation by typing in answers, comments that you have to the questions that have been posed to us. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, and then if my co-panelist here might take a look at the Q&A and maybe type in some responses. They're great. Thank you all so much. You are wonderful.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.